Good morning. Today's daf is Shevuos. Daf Zayin. We're going to begin on Daf Vav Amud Beis. We begin today's daf by thanking all of our sponsors. We thank the Tilson family from Eretz Yisrael for sponsoring all the shurim of the year, as a zechus for Besuras Tovos for all of Am Yisrael. We also thank Shmuel and Rabbi Karabkin for sponsoring all the shurim of the month in commemoration of the Yartzeit of Shmuel's father, Leonard Karabkin, Lipa ben Yecheskel HaKayin, on his Yartzeit. His Yartzeit is on Pesach Sheni. Shama should have an Aliyah, and the family should have a Chama. We also thank Aryeh and Haley Lichtman for sponsoring all the shurim of the week. Lila Nishmas, Haley's mother, Linda Kotin, Rachel Leah Basruva, and Shama should have an Aliyah, and the family should have a Nechama. Okay, back to the Mishnah. So the Mishnah taught us the halacha was as sheyesh b'd yediyah batchila. So we're talking about bringing a carbon olav yored for somebody who knows before he becomes tamei that becoming tamei comes along with certain restrictions, and some of those restrictions are that once a person is tamei, he's not allowed to enter the Beis HaMikdash. He's also not allowed to eat kachim. He can't eat karbanos. We can't eat other things which are kachim. Now the Mishnah tells us, all the way back in Daf Beis Amud Aleph, es sheyesh b'yediyah batchila, v'yediyah basof, v'helam beintayim, harei zeh ba'olav v'yoreh. The person knows before he becomes tamei that becoming tamei comes along with restrictions, and he knows after he became tamei that he has become ritually impure, and he also had some lapse in memory in the middle, and during that period of time that he had a lapse in memory, he either ate kachim or he walked into the Beis HaMikdash. Halach is in such a case he brings the carbon olav yored. As we've explained multiple times, carbon olav yored means it's a carbon chatas. However, it comes along with one important exception, which is that it is a carbon chatas that is on a sliding scale. Depending on your financial standings, is what type of carbon you have to bring. We'll have to bring animal, birds, the carbon mincha. So it all depends on where the person is standing financially. He's going to have to bring a carbon. Now the Gemara asks, we're in Daf Vav Amud Beis, approximately 10 lines from the bottom. It's yesh b'yediyah batchila. Tana Rabbanan. So now the Gemara asks a fundamental question about Tumah. Minayin, how do I know? Sheina kasav medaber ella b'tumas mikdash ukadashav. Now it's important to understand that we're talking about these psukim over here. If you go to Vayikra, Sefer Vayikra, in Parakeh, and you start reading from Pasuk Beis in Parakeh, it says, O nefesh asher tiga b'chol davar tamei, person touches something which is ritually impure, O b'nivlas chayet temeya, or he touches the nevel of the corpse, v'chayet temema, an unkosher, non-kosher animal, O b'nivlas behema temeya, or the corpse of behema temeya, O b'nivlas sheretz tamei, or again, the corpse of a creepy crawly thing. The nelam yimenu, he forgets about it, v'hu tamei v'ashem. He becomes tamei and he has sinned. And you keep on going through these psukim over here, all the way through Pasuk Yud Aleph. You're going to find a number of different descriptions of Tumah, but there's one very important omission. It doesn't say that when the person became tamei that he's done anything else. It just describes what may be perceived as the sin of becoming tamei. So therefore, if you look at Rashi, the way Rashi explains this Gemara is, if you look at Rashi, the Dibur Maskeh is Sheina Kasav Medaber, Parshas Carbon Olav Yored, Shechayvasei Carbon Al Tumah, the parsha which describes this variable carbon, depending on your status, it does not describe over there, Minayin She'ein Mechayvo Al Maga, Ella Imkain Ochel Ba'oso Tumah Kodesh O Nichnas L'Mikdash. How do I know that just maybe perhaps by merely becoming tamei, that's enough to require me to bring a carbon? In other words, the psukim just describe a person who becomes tamei, and then goes on to describe this person bringing a carbon. So now how do I know that those psukim are not requiring any person who comes into contact with anything ritually impure to bring a carbon after or on their way out of Tumah. Now this is a major chiddush, and the Rishonim actually deal with this. Rabbi deals with it among others because we don't find anywhere, unless you're a Kohen becoming tamei to a person, to a dead body, or if it happens to be during the time of Aliyah L'Regel that a person becomes tamei, we don't find anywhere in the Torah that it says it's forbidden to become tamei. Maybe a person doesn't want to be tamei because they don't want to be ritually impure, but the idea, the notion that a person wants to bring a carbon olav yored, which is a chatas, just because they touched a dead animal, is something which is a major novelty that you'd even think that. Now, it's not true. You don't have to bring a carbon. The fact that you think about that is also a big chiddush. But Rashi nevertheless understands that's what the Gemara means. The Gemara means that perhaps one would think that just by merely becoming tamei, that is enough to require the person to bring a carbon. Now, says the Gemara, minayin, how do I know that that's not true? And the only time a person will have to bring a carbon is if while they are tamei, they walk into the Beis HaMikdash. Or if while they are tamei, they eat kachim. That's the Gemara's question. So Gemara answers and says, V'dinu, it's one of these things which I can figure out from the logical inference. I can figure it out by myself. Now, why? Hayel v'his here, v'anashal tuma, v'chayiv carbon al tuma, because the Torah warned us when it came to certain parts of tuma. There's a warning. Torah tells us there's a warning, and there's also a carbon. Where's the warning? The warning of kares, of either dying early or dying without children, is described when a person does this thing b'mezid. So we have a warning in a case where a person intentionally goes ahead while he is tamei, goes ahead and eats kachim. The same thing would be true. The pasuk also goes ahead and is mechayev a carbon, obligates a person to bring the sacrifice when it's by mistake. So we say the following: Ma kishehizir v'anashal tuma. Just like when there is a warning and a punishment of kares. When it comes to tuma, lo hizir v'anashal tumas mikdashu kadashav. The only time you find that there is a punishment of kares is only when a person violates what does that mean? He either enters the sanctuary when he is tamei, or he eats kachim when he's tamei. So that's the only place where there's going to be a chi of karas. There's no chi of karas for a person touching a dead animal, a dead rodent. So now everybody knows there's no chi of karas for that. So therefore, since you understand, if a person intentionally touches a dead rodent, there's no chi of karas. The chi of karas is only if the person subsequently then goes ahead, enters the Beis HaMikdash, or eats kachim. That's when there's the chi of karas. So I would say, when it comes to the mistake, the unintentional case of doing this by mistake, there won't be a punishment or a chiyuv, an obligation to bring a carbon, unless what happened was that he entered the Beis HaMikdash or ate kachim. It's not simply going to be an obligation to bring a carbon olav yored every time a person touches the corpse of a dead animal, which is tamei. So therefore, af chayav carbon al tuma lo chayav el tumas mikdashu kadasha. All right, seems pretty straightforward. You can figure this out by yourself. You compare the obligation or the punishment of kares to the obligation to bring a carbon, just like the obligation or the chiyuv, the punishment of kares is only going to be relevant when the person goes ahead and walks into the Beis HaMikdash or eats kachim while he's tamei intentionally. So the flip side of that, where it's unintentional, not to bring a carbon, is only if he walks into the Beis HaMikdash or eats kachim, not simply by becoming tamei. Okay. So the Gemara says, all right, we could accept that. We could accept, and everyone now accepts, that there's no obligation whatsoever to bring a carbon just by merely becoming tamei. Fine. If that's the case, how do I know which things I would have done that would obligate me to bring a carbon? You're assuming that if a person becomes tamei, the only two actions that require him to bring a carbon is either eating kachim, eating from sacrifices, or walking into the Beis HaMikdash. Okay, fine. Maybe it's for something else. The Gemara says, Ve'ema, perhaps truma. Maybe it's talking about truma. A Kohen's allowed to eat truma, but he's not allowed to eat truma when he's tamei. Maybe he'll have to bring this carbon if he eats truma while he's tamei. Why? Shehiz here v'onesh. There's a warning about eating. There's a warning and a punishment of misa b'dei shemayim, which is different than kares. It means dying early, but it doesn't come along with anything to do with the children. So now, perhaps in that case, I would say that's the case we have to be a carbon olav yored. When a Kohen eats truma while he is tamei, in that case he has to bring carbon olav yored if he knew that he knew beforehand that you're not allowed to. In other words, he knew in advance that if he becomes tamei, he can't eat truma. Then he became tamei. Then he had a lapse in memory. He forgot. So what did he do? He ate truma, and then after he's like, "Oh man, I can't believe it! I just ate truma and I'm tamei." Maybe that's the case where he has to bring a carbon olav yored, and it's not talking about a case where he eats kachim, like from a sacrificial offering, or when he walks into the base of the mikdash. Gemara says, no, that's not going to work. Why? Because lo ashkechan avon misa dechayiv aleh carbon. We do not find when there's a chiyuv of misa b'dei shemayim that the flip side of that is that a person is going to have to bring a carbon when it's a mistake. Gemara says, really? Is that really true? Ema hani mili carbon kavua. It's true that you don't find a person to bring a carbon chatas, which is not a sliding scale carbon. It's not variable. It's set. Anyone who has to bring a carbon chatas has to bring exactly the same carbon chatas. Aval olav yored nasi. Maybe he should actually have to bring a carbon olav yored, the variable carbon. In other words, you're right that you'll never bring a carbon chatas in a case where you know for sure. We know there's chiyuv misa b'dei shemayim, but maybe carbon olav yored, which has that halachic dispensation that depending on your finances, how much you're going to have to bring. Maybe in that case you will have to do it, even when it comes to misa b'dei shemayim. Now, what's the rationale to say this? Midi dahava, just like we find that shmias kol v'pitus v'sayim. Shmias kol and pitus. What is shmias kol? We'll get to this later in the sechta. Shmias kol is when a person takes an oath that he does not know edus. There's the pasuk in the Torah that says that a person is obligated to say edus, to report witness, to become a witness, to report their testimony on a particular case if they know it. Now, a person takes an oath; they don't have any knowledge of a particular circumstance. That's shmias kol. Now, what's the halacha? If a person does that intentionally, there's no chiyuv misa at all. And still, what's the halacha? The halacha is the carbon olav yored if he does that unintentionally. The same thing is true with Shevuos bitoy. Again, when a person violates an oath, they said they won't do something, or it's a Shevuos sheker. He said, I don't want to get into this discussion right now, but essentially what he does is he swears falsely, whether it's b'mezid, intentionally or unintentionally. In that case, we find that even though there's no kares or chiyuv misa, still there is a carbon olav yored. So we find carbon olav yored can be introduced. The Gemara says no. Amar kra, this is very important. If you remember this, Amar kra ba. The pasuk says very clearly, "Oh, asher yiga betumas adam l'chol tumas asher yitma ba." Now we find many times when it says ba, the specification of ba is ba lima'ute. It comes to exclude what? Truma. So therefore, in other words, you're right. Logically, it can be that we would exclude the case of eating truma. Sorry, I said that wrong. Logically, what you can say is that the chiyuv, carbon olav yored, bringing this variable sacrifice, would be for a Kohen who ate truma while he is tamei by mistake. However, the word ba in the pasuk tells you we're going to exclude that case. So therefore, when do we find that a person brings a carbon olav yored, this variable carbon? That's when he knew in advance that becoming tamei restricts him from walking into the base of mikdash or partaking in a meal that includes sacrifices. Now, he became tamei, and then he forgot that he was tamei, or he forgot that it's also for him to do any of those things. He did it, he walked into the base of mikdash, or he ate a carbon, and then after he's like, oh man, I just remembered that I'm not allowed to do that. I just recognized I'm not supposed to walk into the base of mikdash, or I'm not supposed to eat this carbon. So now he brings his carbon olav yored. That's the case where carbon olav yored is relevant. How about the exact same case, but what was the error that he made? The error was that he ate truma. In that case, logically, yes, you'd bring in carbon olav yored. However, the pasuk of ba tells you no carbon olav yored when a person mistakenly eats truma while he is tamei. Now the Gemara goes on and says, okay, since it says ba, which is an exclusion, but how do you know what to exclude? Ema ba l'me'ute mikdash. Delo sagile b'carbon olav yored. How do you know that ba, the extra word ba in the pasuk, is excluding where a person's error is that he ate truma? Maybe ba is telling you that if a person walks into the Beis HaMikdash, a carbon olav yored is not sufficient. In other words, maybe, yes, if a person violates or makes his mistake and violates truma by eating it when he's tamei, he brings the carbon olav yored. What does the word ba come to exclude? It excludes the case of a person who walks into the Beis HaMikdash. In such a case, it will not be sufficient for him to bring a carbon olav yored. Maybe he'll have to bring a real fixed chatas. Adam, I see carbon kavua. So Gemara says, Kari Rava aled de Rabbi dola mayim miboros amukim. Rava says, I'm about to teach you something that I learned from Rabbi, and this teaching that I have from Rabbi is an example of how deep Rabbi's understanding of Torah was. He was able to go ahead and draw water from the depths of the wells. What does he mean? He means that he really understood how to read psukim, how to darshan a pasuk, how to get to the truth of a pasuk, and therefore, says Rabbi, brace yourselves, because this one's going to be a really good one. What does he say? The Tanya, for it says in a brisa, Rabbi Omer, Rabbi teaches us the following: Ekra ani chaya. The pasuk mentions a chaya. Behema lama nemar. What is this talking about? So this is a pasuk which says as follows: O nefesh asher tiga b'chol davar tamei, or a person who will come into contact with anything which is tamei. We read this before. It's a pasuk in Vayikra, and it says, "A nefesh asher tiga b'chol davar tamei, o benivlas chaya tameya," or in the corpse of a chaya tameya, and then it goes on and says, "O benivlas behema tameya," or the corpse of behema tameya. Now, what is the difference between a chaya and a behema? Now, the truth is, a chaya generally describes a wild animal, and a behema describes a domesticated animal. However, it's not so specific. All animals would be included in a chaya. So therefore, the Gemara says the following: Ekra ani chaya, behema lama nemra. Why does the pasuk have to go through every different type of mammal there? Why can't it just say chaya and it'll include behema? So he understands. Rabbi says nemar kan behema tameya. Now that it says behema, it says nemar kan in this pasuk behema tameya. V'nemar lehalon, and it says later on behema tameya. What's that pasuk talking about? So we'll read that pasuk. That pasuk is in Vayikra, Parak Zayin, pasuk Chaf Aleph. And what does it say? That is talking about V'nefesh kisiga b'chol tamei b'tumas adam o b'behema tameya o b'chol sheketz tamei v'achal mi b'sar zevach hashlamim. This pasuk is very clear. What does it say? A person becomes tamei, whether he's tamei because he touched a person who was tamei, or an animal that was tamei, or some kind of rodent that was tamei. And what does he do? V'achal mi b'sar zevach hashlamim. He partook in the meal of a carbon shlamim. So clearly, we have another pasuk which is talking about a person eating a carbon while he is tamei. That pasuk is open and shut. This is a pasuk in Parashas Tzav. It says very clearly that it's talking about a person who eats kachin. Now, what are we going to do? We'll draw a hekesh. We're going to say, just like in the pasuk later on in Parashas Tzav, it's talking about Tumas Kodesh, Afkan, Tumas Kodesh. We'll say in this case also Tumas Kodesh. In other words, how do we make this hekesh? We make this hekesh because of the fact that the word behema is extra. You could have just said a person touches a chaya. A chaya would have included any kind of behema. So why does it say chaya and behema? The answer is the extra word behema was put there lahakish eleh, to draw this juxtaposition between these two different psukim and say, just like later when it says behema, it's talking about a person who goes out and eats kachim. In this case as well, it's talking about a person who eats kachim. So therefore, what do we see from here? Rabbi teaches us that if a person eats kachim while he is tamei, that is sufficient for him to bring a carbon olav yored. So now, which case is the case where brings a carbon olav yored, where a person's tamei and he eats kachim? Now the Gemara says, okay, very nice. Ashkef and Tumas Kodesh. Tumas Mikdash Minalan. Very nice. Now we figured out that one of the cases where we bring a carbon olav yored is if a person eats from a carbon while he is tamei. How do I know that if a person walks into the Beis Hamikdash while he's tamei, he also has to bring a carbon olav yored? Amar Kra, the pasuk says, "B'chal kodesh lo siga, ve'el hamikdash lo savo." So this is talking about when a woman is experiencing tumas yoledes. So while she has tumas yoledes, the pasuk says very clearly, two of her restrictions are chol kodesh lo siga, she can't touch anything which is sanctified, but mikdash lo sava, she can't walk into the Beis Hamikdash. What does that mean? Iskish mikdash lekodesh. We now have this pasuk which says these two are always going to be linked. And therefore, whenever we have a halacha about eating kachim, it's always going to be relevant to walking to the Beis Hamikdash. So now we've figured out how we know that if the time a person reads the carbon olav yored when they're tamei is when they accidentally eat kachim or when they walk into the Beis Hamikdash. The Gemara says, okay, if that's the case, so then we have not yet X'd out truma. We're back to square one. Why are we back to square one? Because ihachi truma nami. That would include truma as well. Why? The Amar Marbachal Kodesh Lo Siga, the pasuk tells you about the Yoledes, so she should not touch anything which is Kodesh. It says B'chal Kodesh Lo Siga. L'rabos esat truma. The extra word kal tells you all sanctified things, even truma. So now the Gemara says, okay, very good, you're right, but you forgot something from our Amud, from our Gemara. Hamiyat Rachmana ba. The word ba excludes something. So what does it exclude? It excludes truma. Okay, the Gemara says, Ema balam u'tei mikdash. If that's the case, then you're right, you have a hekesh, but if there's a miyot, if there's an exclusion in the pasuk, it excludes something. Maybe that excludes a case where she walks into the Beis Hamikdash. The Gemara says, no. I'll use my brains for this one. Mistavra mikdash lo maitina. If I have to choose one to exclude, I would rather not exclude the case if we're walking to the Beis Hamikdash. Why? Shekaim b'kares kamosa. The violation of doing that intentionally is kares, just like eating from a carbon. Gemara says, hold on. You're going to use logic? I'll use another piece of logic. Adarabba truma lo maitina. And I would rather not exclude truma. Why? Shekaim achila. It's similar to the case of eating from a carbon, because eating a carbon and eating truma are the same thing because they are essentially the same type of act, which is eating. So Gemara says, you're right. We have to start all over again. Let's go back to the drawing board and figure out all over again how we know that if a person becomes tamei and say this again. How do I know that the chiyuv, the obligation to bring a carbon olav yored for someone who is ritually impure, is only if they walk into the Beis Hamikdash or they eat kachim while they are tamei? When it comes to a shlamim, it says kares 3 times. What are those 3 times? So there are a number of psukim. One pasuk is in Vayikra Chaf Beis, it says over there, Kol Isha Sheyikra Mikol Zarachim Al Kadashim Asher Yakdish B'nei Yisrael V'Tumaso Alav V'Nichrusa HaNefesh. We have 3 psukim. And it was the psukim are quoted on the side of the Gemara, but there are 3 times when it comes to a carbon shlamim that the pasuk talks about kares. Why does it have to say it 3 times? So Lama, the Gemara says Achas L'Klal, one of them to say it generally, v'achas leprat, another one to say it specifically, v'achas letuma haksuva b'torah stam. Another one is more general. So now, in case you think we are back to the klal prat to klal sugya, nope, we're not. We're on to an entirely different type of discussion. And Rashi goes through a whole description over here, which is that we know from 2 days ago that there's something called a klal prat to klal. Klal pratu klal is notorious as a generalization, a specification, and then another generalization. What you walk away from that is saying whatever this halacha is talking about needs to be something similar to the prat. Not exactly like the prat, but similar to the prat. Here we are in a different world. We are in a world of something called kol davar shahaya b'chlal, v'yatzam in a klal alamed. We say this during davening. Rosh Omer. So what does that say? What does this mean? Basically, it's a different type of mechanism, which is if you have a generalization and then a specification, what you're going to say is the specification is not limiting it to one case, but it's describing the generalization. It's different than a klal prat to klal. Rashi explains how it's different in a number of cases. I don't want to get too sidetracked with this. But the basic point, and Tosfos argues on this, but we can go with Rashi, is klal prat to klal needs to be close to each other. So, for example, if a pasuk says a halacha, and then a specification, and then a generalization, it's all in the same pasuk. Like when it comes to Shabbos Aveda, the pasuk has a generalization, a specification, a generalization, all in the same pasuk. However, if you have a generalization in one parsha, and then a specification in another parsha, here it's parshas Tzav and parshas Emor. It's pretty far away from each other. So in that case, it's not going to be a klal prat to klal. Rather, it will be kol davar v'shaya b'chlal, something which was included in the generalization, and then later on in the Torah, it was repeated, but more specifically. What we're going to do is we're going to say that the specification is not limiting the klal so much it's only that case, but it's limiting the generalization to a certain standard. So let's see how that works out in this case. Ella Amarava, Shalosh Krisis B'Shlamim. It says cars 3 times when it comes to a Shlamim. Lama, for what reason? Achas L'Klal, one for a generalization. The Achas L'Prat, another one for the Prat. Achas L'Tuma Ksuv B'Torah Stam, V'Eini Yodea Mahi. I don't know what that is for. Savi Omer, Tumas Kodesh. V'Eino Eini L'Tumas Kodesh, T'nafka Mid Rabbi, T'neo Eini L'Tumas Mikdash, you'll apply to Tumas Mikdash. Let's just explain what this means. It says when it comes to a shlamim, 3 times that a person can violate, eat the shlamim inappropriately and get karas. What is that? Person's tummy, eats a korban shlamim, he's chayiv karas when he does it intentionally. Then it says it a second time. In that case, again, the first case is when a person eats kachim betuma. A person eats anything which is kachim, it's a karban, he eats it when he's tamei, chayiv karas. In another case, it says specifically shlamim. Why in one place does it say kachim, generalization? In another place, it says shlamim. Shlamim is a peace offering. There are many other kinds of karbanos. In other words, it's said already all kachim. So why are you then repeating the same halacha and only mentioning a shlamim? So we understand from there is that it has to be kachim mizbeach. If a person eats any kachim mizbeach, while he is tamei, the chiyuv karas if he does it intentionally. And if he does it unintentionally, there'll be a korban olav yored. Now, why does the Torah limit it to a shlamim? To limit it to only kachim mizbeach, which is sanctified items which go on the mizbeach. However, it excludes kachim at the kabayis. So if somebody donated some kind of food to the communal fund that belonged to the Beis HaMikdash, and then someone ate it while they're tamei, no chiyuv kares in such a case. It has to be a korban. Then it went ahead and it said again another generalization. So now I'm a little confused. I have a generalization which includes anything which is sanctified or anything which is consecrated. I have a specification of shlamim which says it has to be something which is dedicated to the mizbeach, and not anything which is consecrated to the fund of the sanctuary. And then again I have another one which again opens it up to all kachim. So now, what's the third one doing? So the Gemara says, I don't know. So Havi Omer, what I'm going to say is, this refers to a case of Tumas Kodesh. Now, I don't need it to tell me Tumas Kodesh, the person eating something which is sanctified. Why not? Because I already learned it. Rabbi already taught this to me earlier from this brilliant hekesh that he made to explain how the 2 things go together. Now, Tumas Mikdash, apply it to Tumas Mikdash. Now, this is the concept of Im'eno Inyan Tneil Inyan. If the pasuk tells me something that I already know, it must be telling me to apply it to another case. Okay, so now, according to Rabbi, I now know where the source is that if a person is tamei, he has to be covered olav yored only if he becomes with the either eats kachim, or he walks into the Beis HaMikdash. The Gemara says that's not going to work. We need that limud to teach me Rabbi's halacha. Who's Rabbi? I'm Rabbi. Shalosh krisus b'shlamim. Lamali, it says krisus 3 times by shlamim. Why? Achas l'klal, like we just said for the generalization. The achas l'prat, and one of them to limit it only to mizbeach, relevant kachim, but not to Just the general fun. Bevo teaches me that the third one teaches us that there are some things which are in nechalim. For example, wood. A person eats wood from the Beis HaMikdash. So now, good luck. But what's the halacha? It's not going to taste good, but what's the halacha? Does the person now have to be a carbon or Yomi? So you have to have that to exclude that case. No, the third one will include that case that you are actually chayav kares for that. Now, hold on. Now, you might suggest that, well, that's only one opinion. But according to Shimon, you're not chayav kares for it. So for him, the third one will include if a person eats a chatas, which is going to where the avodah is done in the inside mizbeach. The salkatay, I would have thought, and then therefore in other words, the bottom line is there are two things here you could include: either a person eating wood from the mizbeach, or a person eating from a carbon chatas, which is serviced on the inside mizbeach. One of those two. If you're a Bavo person, you'll say it's about eating the wood. If you're a B'Shimon person, you'll say it's about a carbon, which is serviced on the inside mizbeach. And either way, you'll have something to include from that. Now, Kamash Blan D'Mechayev. So the Gemara says, okay, fine. So we're kind of in trouble over here because we don't know that this is including Tumas Mikdash Ukdashav. Maybe it's including these other cases over here. You're right. We're not focusing on the word kares that it says there. We're focusing on the word tuma that it says there. Why does it have to say tuma 3 times? In other words, we'll repeat the drasha exactly the same way, just that the generalization of tuma, the specification of tuma, and the generalization of tuma, and that includes tumas mikdash ukdashav. So Ella Amri Nardai Mishmei the Rava shows Tumas B'Shlam Lama. Again, we'll go through Achas the Kla, one for the generalization, the Achas the Pra, and one specifically for a carbon Shlamim, which tells you Kachim is Be'ach. Ba'achas the Tuma Haksuva V'Tara Stavin Yudea. One of them is for general Tuma, which says in the pasuk in Yudea. I don't know what that is. Oh, now I have it. I say Avi Omer. I'll say Tumas Kodesh. That's a person who eats something which is Kodesh while he's Tamei. Now the main eating the Tumas Kodesh, and if you don't need that to teach you the halachas Tumas Kodesh, why the nafka mid Rabbi? Because we learned it from Rabbi earlier on the Amud. Eating Tumas Mikdash, you'll apply it to a person who walks in the base Mikdash when he's Tamei. The Gemara says, but we need that. In other words, the word tuma is not extra. You need it because either the kares tuma. In other words, the the pasuk won't read without that word. What's it talking about? If you don't write the word tuma, so then why are you chayav kares? What happened over here? What's the circumstance? So therefore, it's not extra. You can't use it for anything. Gemara says, all right, back to the drawing board. Alam Rava asya tumaso. Where do we know that a person who is tamei has to bring a carbon only if they eat kachim or walk into the Beis HaMikdash? We have Gzera Shava. It says over here by Olav Yored that in the Parshas Vayikra L'chol Tumaso for all tuma. Uksiv hasam, and it says over there that's with regard to a person who walks into the Beis HaMikdash on purpose. Tamei o tumasavo. He's tamei and his tumah remains on him. Mala alon tumas mikdash, just like in that case, it was referring to a person walking to the Beis HaMikdash when he was tamei. Afkan, in this case, tumas mikdash. It's talking about tumas mikdash. So Gemara says, okay, fine. Hold on. We just solved this whole thing with one Gzera Shava. So now, do you remember the whole Amud? We were talking about this word ba, ela ba, lamali. So why do I need the word ba to exclude truma? In other words, we're so busy saying there's 3 cases. A person who walks into the Beis HaMikdash when they're tamei, a person who eats from a carbon when he's tamei, and a person who eats truma when he's tamei. Now, we felt so much that we needed the word ba to exclude truma. Now, if you're learning this halacha from this Gzera Shava of tumaso, why would you have thought that truma was included? It's not included in this Gzera Shava. It's not part of this discussion. So, ba lamali, Gemara says, actually, lerabos. Ba is not coming to exclude, it's coming to include. L'rabos nevelas of tahar. It includes a case where a person became tamei by consuming the dead body of an oaf tahar. So you have a kosher bird, so I don't know, chicken, and this chicken was not slaughtered properly. It died. And a person went ahead and ate it. Now he becomes tamei from that. Now if that person walks into the Beis HaMikdash, or a person eats kachim, he'll have to be in carbon olav yored. Now, why would you think it's different? Because this is a different type of tumah. Up until now, we're talking about tumas maga, where a person touches it. So simply touching it, in other words, that tumah is a little bit more strict because it's so strict that just simply touching it makes you tamei. This nevelas of tahar is a person only becomes tamei when it passes through what's called the beis habaliyah, when he swallows it. So therefore, you would think that's a lighter kind of tumah, and therefore you want it to bring a carbon olav yored if he walks into the Beis HaMikdash or eats kachim. So this word ba tells you, yes, even in that case, you have to make carbon olav yored. Where it says, hold on a second. Ha'amrit ba mi'utahu. You've been telling me that ba is an exclusion. How did it all of a sudden become an inclusion? Gemara says, mishum de mi'utahu iyater, because it's an extra exclusion. So therefore, we use it to as an addition. Ksiv oyiga de bar negia in. La bar negia lo, since it says tamei, I would think only something which is touching comes along with this carbon. Uksiv ba, and it says ba miuta havi. So you have two mutim. Havi miuta achamit, miuta achamit el rabos. Basically, the concept of double negative. If you say something twice, the double negative is a positive. So you have two exclusions. So you actually end up including it. Now the Mishnah goes on. It tells us another case. Yesh ba yediyah batchila, ve'ein ba yediyah basof. Person knows initially that if he becomes tamei, he can't walk into Beis HaMikdash ikachim. He becomes tamei, he does it, and he never finds out. He never has that epiphany, oh my gosh, hold on, I walked into Beis HaMikdash when I was tamei, or ate kachim when I was tamei. He never finds that out. What's the halacha? So the Mishnah told us that the carbon, the soyer la Hashem, that is brought on Yom Kippur, it serves as a partial atonement. What does that mean? That means that all punishment, all yisurim, all suffering will be suspended, but he does not get a full kapara, full atonement, until he brings his carbon. So now the Gemara says, Tanabanim, v'chipur ala kodesh, mitumos b'nei Yisrael. This carbon, the soyer la Hashem, this is just quick background. It's actually in this week's Parshas Achrei. We're reading it this Shabbos. It talks about on Yom Kippur, they take two identical goats. They would draw lots. One of them is called the Sar L'Azazel. It has procedure out there, which is a complicated procedure where it was thrown off of a cliff. Another one is slaughtered inside the Beis HaMikdash. And that one serves as an atonement for various different things. One of the things is for a person who became tamei, ate kachim, walked into the Beis HaMikdash, didn't know about it, it serves as a protection for this person until he finally finds out and brings the carbon. So now, Yeshli be'inyan zeh lahavi shalosh tumos. I would include that this soyer l'Hashem, this goat, covers for three different tumos. Which ones? Tumas avodah zara, the impurity of idol worship, the tumas gila arayos, the impurity of immoral behaviors, and tumas shvichas damim, the impurity of murder. Now, how do I know that these things are considered to be impure? These are big averos. But impure, who omer leman tameis mikdashi. It says clearly the word tamei is used to describe someone who serves avodah zara, idol worship. Begila arayos, who omer ushmartim es mishmarti levilti asos mechukas hatoevos lo setamu behem. So you see clearly when it comes to gila arayos, immoral behaviors, it's described as Tuma. B'shvichas damim, when it comes to murder, it says you will not make the world or the land impure. So now, these three things are described as impurities. Perhaps the Sar Hashem will cover for them. I would think that this goat actually serves as an atonement for those three things. Talmud where the pasuk teaches you, no, me tumos b'nei Yisrael. Only specific types of tumos, v'lo kol tumos. Not every single one of the tumos. Gilui arayos, shvichas damim, and avodah zara are not covered by Sar Hashem. Now, the Gemara goes on and says, Ma matzinu. What do we find? Shechilik hakatzav. The pasuk goes ahead and creates a difference in this type of carbon. The Gemara is going to discuss this on tomorrow's Amud, but the basic idea is that there's a concept called the variable carbon of carbon olav yored. Mechlal kol tumos. There is, when it comes to tumas mikdashu kadashav, person who eats kachim, or walks into the Beis Hamikdash when he's tamei, gets to bring a carbon olav yored. So therefore, I would say, ma'amatzinu shechal kekasav michlal kol tumas. This tumas mikdash kedashav has its own halachic dispensation. Haviomer to which one is that? It's tumas mikdash kedashav. Afkan, when it comes to Sar Lashem, it is only going to atone for tumas mikdash kedashav. So that's how we know that the Sar Lashem serves as a partial atonement for someone who ate kach and walked into the Beis Hamikdash when he's tamei, but of course not for a person who was over gila rayis, shvichas dam or avodah zarah. None of those cases. Rabbi Yehuda, Shimon Omer, Shimon says, I don't have to have such a fancy type of mamatzin. I could just figure this out by myself. Read the pasuk. Why? Aryeh Omer. It says there, the keeper ala kodesh mi tumos. It says clearly mi tumos. Now mi tumos kodesh yachal al kol tumos kodesh yesar zemachar tamalamer mi pishayim l'chal chatasam. Now I would think that it goes ahead and it atones for everything. So we learn no tamalomer. It only works for certain things. Now, what does that mean? It says mi pishayim al kol chatosam. It says pesha and chatos in the same pasuk. What's pesha? So a pesha is when a person does something b'meisid, and then a chatos is when someone does something unintentionally. So now the Gemara says chatoyim dumyim to peshayim. We treat them the same. We treat unintentional things and intentional things the same. In other words, it doesn't mean that the atonement will be exactly the same, but they follow the same procedures. Ma pesham she'en b'nei karban. Just like when it comes to a pesha, if there's no ability to bring a karban, af chatoyim she'en b'nei karban. The same thing will be true when it comes to chatayim where there's no carbon. Now, when it comes to a mezid, a person can't bring a carbon for a mezid. A carbon is only brought for a shogeg. Now, the same thing will be true when it comes to something which is b'shogeg. There are certain cases where you can't bring a carbon. For example, if you didn't have the idea, you don't know about it beforehand. Now the Gemara asks, how do I know? How do I know for a case where a person knows initially that if he becomes tamei it's a problem, and then at the end he never finds out about it, that this goat actually will atone for him? Tola means it's like a partial atonement. This refers to a case where there's a chiyav chatos, and that is our case. 1 minute, should we do a little bit more? Let's go. I would have included 3 different tumos. Tumas avodah zarah, tumas gilarais, tumas shvichas damim. So now the Gemara asks, "How about avodah zarah hechitami? What type of avodah zarah do you think this will actually atone for? If we're talking about a person who violates avodah zarah b'mezid intentionally, barkateleu. No carbon's working with this person. He is chayiv misa. If it was by mistake, then bar carbon who? Let him bring a carbon. What's this for? The Gemara says, the mezid below asrubei. It's so bad we did it intentionally, but it didn't have the qualifications for him to be put to death. He didn't get a warning. Next one. Or b'shogeg, if it was a mistake, below yisyatale, he didn't know about it. Gilei Rai, it's the same thing. Nami, what's the case? If he was over, he served this immoral behavior intentionally, it's chayiv misa. If it was by mistake, par carbon, let him bring carbon. Rest is the same thing. It's been amazing, he did it intentionally, below asrubei didn't warn him. B'shogeg yisyatale, he didn't know about it. Shvichas the same case. The same question. What's the case? Even if it was intentionally that he killed somebody, bring to Bezdin and have him put to death. If he killed someone by mistake, we just learned the whole Masechta, which talks about what to do. Let him run to Aryeh Mikla, where it says, the mezid, it could be talking about a case where it was b'mezid v'lo asrubei, he didn't get warning, so therefore he can't be put to death. B'shogeg v'lo yisyadalei, he didn't know about it. No, he was swinging an axe, and a piece fell off and killed somebody. He didn't know that he killed somebody. He was spacing out. Or maybe it's one of those cases where there's an exception. For example, we saw that there's a difference between going up with the axe, going down with the axe. So then that will be a case where he doesn't go to galus. He still needs to have a kapara. Have a wonderful day.